The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a deep rumble that echoed through the vast hall. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked forward, her boots clicking against the polished stone floor. Above her, hundreds of alien species watched from tiered seating that rose like a stadium toward the domed ceiling. The air hummed with different languages, electronic beeps and strange sounds she had no names for. Elena had been to the council many times before, but today felt different. The emergency beacon that had summoned all species to this gathering carried a tone of desperation she had never heard. As Earth's representative, she took her seat in the small section reserved for humanity. Around her sat ambassadors from dozens of other young species, all looking as confused as she felt. At the center of the chamber stood two groups that commanded everyone's attention. On the left, the Zephyrians floated in perfect formation. Their bodies looked like living crystal, catching and reflecting light in patterns that hurt human eyes to watch for too long. They moved without sound, communicating through flashes of colored light that pulsed through their transparent forms. Their leader, the High Resonator, was twice the size of the others and glowed with an inner fire that made the air around him shimmer. On the right stood the representatives of the hegemony. These beings had once been biological, but now they were more machine than flesh. Metal limbs moved with perfect precision, and glowing red sensors served as eyes. Cables and tubes connected different parts of their bodies, and Elena could hear the soft whir of motors and the click of mechanical joints. Their leader, the Supreme Node, was a towering figure whose head was completely replaced by a mass of blinking lights and spinning data cores. The chamber fell silent as the council's speaker, an ancient being whose species Elena had never learned to pronounce, rose from the central platform. Its voice carried to every corner of the hall without amplification. "Representatives of the galaxy," the speaker began, "we face a crisis that threatens the stability of our civilization. The war between the Zephyrian collective and the biomechanical hegemony has entered its 4th century. What began as a border dispute has consumed 12 star systems and shows no sign of ending." Elena leaned forward. Everyone knew about the war, but it had always seemed distant from human space. The two ancient powers had been fighting since before humans had discovered fire, let alone space travel. The High Resonator stepped forward, and his voice echoed strangely, as if it came from inside everyone's heads at once. "The hegemony has refused all reasonable terms for peace. They seek to convert all biological life into their mechanical abominations. We have no choice but to defend the purity of natural existence." The Supreme Node's response came as a series of electronic tones that the chamber's translation system rendered into words. The Zephyrians speak of purity, while they crystallize entire worlds, turning living planets into lifeless monuments to their vanity. Logic demands that biological inefficiency be corrected through technological improvement. Elena watched the exchange with growing unease. She had heard variations of this argument before, but never directed at the younger species like this. Usually, the ancient powers ignored the newer members of the galaxy entirely. The speaker raised one of its many appendages for silence. The Council has determined that this conflict can no longer be contained through traditional means. The war has grown beyond the ability of either faction to conclude independently. Therefore, we call upon all member species to choose allegiance and provide assistance to end this stalemate. A murmur ran through the chamber as the meaning became clear. Elena felt her stomach tighten. They wanted everyone to pick a side in a war that had been raging since before most of their civilizations existed. The High Resonator's glow intensified as he addressed the younger species directly. "Those who join with the collective will receive access to our crystal technology. Your ships will move faster than light itself, and your worlds will know abundance beyond imagination." The Supreme Node's optical sensors focused on the same section. "The hegemony offers biological enhancement and technological integration. Inefficient organic limitations will be removed. Optimal performance will be achieved through mechanical precision." Elena looked around at the other ambassadors. Many seemed interested, even eager. The promises being made were incredible. Faster than light travel without the massive engines currently required. Medical technology that could cure any disease. Energy sources that could power entire worlds. But she thought about the cost. 12 star systems destroyed. Billions of lives lost. Entire species wiped out because they happened to live in the path of the war. The speaker gestured toward the human section. "The Council recognizes Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Human Federation. Elena stood, feeling hundreds of alien eyes focus on her. Her mouth felt dry, but her voice was steady when she spoke. The Human Federation has reviewed the situation carefully. We understand the significance of this moment and the expectations placed upon us. She paused, looking directly at both faction leaders. However, humanity must respectfully decline to choose either side in this conflict. The silence that followed was complete. Elena could hear her own heartbeat in the absolute quiet. Then the chamber erupted. Alien voices rose in a cacophony of surprise, anger, and confusion. Electronic screeches mixed with telepathic static that made Elena's temples throb. Several ambassadors stood up, shouting in languages her translator couldn't keep up with. The high resonator's glow flared so bright that several species had to shield their optical sensors. When he spoke, his mental voice carried an edge of disbelief. You refuse both offers? This is impossible. All species must choose. It is the natural order. The Supreme Node's processors whirred loudly as he calculated this unexpected response. Error in logic detected. No species has ever refused participation. Historical precedent indicates universal compliance with faction selection protocols. Elena remained standing, despite the chaos around her. Humanity chooses neither side because we cannot support a war that has brought nothing but destruction to the galaxy. We will not provide weapons, ships, or soldiers to continue this conflict. The speaker struggled to restore order, but the chamber remained in uproar. Finally, an elderly ambassador from the Centauri Alliance managed to make himself heard above the noise. But you must choose, he said, his voice cracking with age and stress. Every species chooses. My people chose the collective 50 years ago. The Rigel Commonwealth joined the hegemony a century before that. It's how things work. It's how things have always worked. Elena looked at him with sympathy. Then perhaps it's time for things to work differently. The high resonator pulsed with patterns of light that the translator rendered as laughter, though it sounded more like breaking glass. Naive children playing at diplomacy. You know nothing of galactic politics or the true nature of this conflict. Your species has existed for mere moments compared to our ancient wisdom. The Supreme Node's agreement came through rapid data bursts. Confirmed. Human civilization registers as primitive on all developmental scales, computational capacity insufficient for understanding complex strategic necessities, emotional reasoning detected over logical analysis. Other ambassadors began voicing similar thoughts. The humans were too young, too inexperienced, too emotional to understand what they were refusing. Some suggested that humanity simply needed time to see reason. Others proposed assigning them to one faction or the other regardless of their preference. Elena listened to it all with growing anger, but kept her expression calm. When the voices finally died down, she spoke again. You're right that humanity is young compared to your civilizations, but we've learned something in our short existence that you seem to have forgotten. She looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as she could. We've learned that some choices are false choices. That sometimes the only winning move is not to play the game at all. The high resonator's form flickered with what might have been irritation. Pretty words, but reality will force your hand. The war spreads closer to your space every year. Eventually, you will have no choice but to choose. The Supreme Node's agreement was swift. Predictive models confirm inevitable human capitulation within acceptable timeframes. Current stance represents temporary emotional response, not sustainable strategic position. Elena smiled, though there was no warmth in it. You may be right. But until that day comes, humanity's answer remains the same. We choose neither. As she sat down, Elena could feel the weight of history pressing against this moment. Two ancient powers that had shaped the galaxy for millennia, and they couldn't understand why anyone would refuse to join their eternal war. But as she looked around at the other young species, she saw something in their eyes that gave her hope. Questions that hadn't been there before. Doubts about the inevitability of choosing sides in someone else's fight. The war between the Zephyrians and the hegemony would continue. But for the first time in centuries, someone had said no to both of them. That had to count for something. 6 months had passed since humanity's declaration at the Galactic Council, and Captain Marcus Chen was beginning to understand what that decision really meant. He stood on the bridge of the UNSC Indomitable, watching his navigation officer plot another course around a war zone that seemed to grow larger every day. Sir, we're receiving multiple distress signals from the New Hebrides system, reported Lieutenant Sarah Park from the communications station. Her voice carried the tension they all felt these days. It's bad, Captain. Marcus nodded grimly. New Hebrides was one of humanity's agricultural worlds, home to nearly 100,000 farmers and their families. It was supposed to be far enough from the war to be safe. That assumption was proving to be dangerously wrong. What's the tactical situation? Marcus asked his sensor operator. 2 Zephyrian crystal ships in high orbit, conducting orbital bombardment of the surface. Sensor readings indicate at least 3 hegemony infiltration units operating in the mountain regions. Both sides appear to be targeting civilian areas. Marcus felt his jaw clench. This was exactly what Ambassador Vasquez had warned them about. The war was spreading, and the ancient powers didn't seem to care who got caught in the crossfire. Time to New Hebrides? 18 hours at maximum burn, sir. Do it. And send a priority message to Fleet Command. Tell them we're responding to a humanitarian crisis. The bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency as the Indomitable changed course. Marcus knew what they were all thinking because he was thinking the same thing. His small patrol fleet consisted of 3 ships against 2 advanced alien vessels and unknown ground forces. By every military calculation, this was suicide. But Marcus had read the reports from other border worlds. Entire populations converted into cybernetic slaves by the hegemony. Farming communities crystallized alive by Zephyrian energy weapons. The ancient powers treated human lives like they treated everything else in this war, as resources to be used or obstacles to be removed. 18 hours later, the Indomitable dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the New Hebrides system. What Marcus saw on his main screen made his blood run cold. The planet's surface glowed with the telltale blue light of Zephyrian crystal bombardment. Entire sections of farmland had been turned into glass sculptures that reflected the planet's sun in painful patterns. But worse were the areas of mechanical darkness where hegemony biofactories had taken root, spreading like cancer across the landscape. "Sir, I'm reading massive civilian casualties," reported his sensor operator, his voice shaking. "The Zephyrians are targeting food production centers. The hegemony they're converting the refugee camps into processing facilities." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his own family back on Earth. His daughter was about the same age as many of the children down on that planet. Open a channel to both faction fleets. "Sir, are you sure that's—" "Do it." The main screen split to show 2 very different alien commanders. On the left, a Zephyrian subresonator pulsed with impatient light patterns. On the right, a hegemony processing unit's mechanical face showed no expression at all. "This is Captain Marcus Chen of the United Nations Space Command. You are conducting military operations against civilians in violation of galactic law. I demand you cease fire immediately and withdraw from this system." The Zephyrian's response came as flashing lights that the translator rendered into words dripping with disdain. "Human vessel, you have no authority here. We are engaged in legitimate military operations to deny resources to the enemy. Withdraw or be destroyed." The hegemony unit's reply was equally dismissive. "Human interference is not acceptable. Biological resources in this system are being optimized for strategic purposes. Your presence disrupts operational efficiency." Marcus looked at his tactical display. The 2 crystal ships hung in high orbit like deadly jewelry, while the hegemony ground forces continued their grisly work below. His 3 ships were outgunned and outnumbered, but they were also faster and more maneuverable than anything the aliens had built. "All ships, this is Chen. We're going to hit both factions simultaneously. Target the crystal ships with kinetic rounds full spread. Launch EMP torpedoes at the hegemony processing sites. Priority is civilian evacuation, not military victory." "Sir," his weapons officer said carefully, "attacking both sides at once is insane? Probably. But so is letting them murder innocent people while we watch." Marcus settled into his command chair. Execute. The battle that followed was unlike anything in human military doctrine. The Indomitable and her sister ships danced between the massive crystal formations and biomechanical constructs, using their smaller size and human unpredictability to stay ahead of alien weapons systems. When Zephyrian energy beams tried to lock onto them, the human ships scattered in random patterns that confused their targeting computers. When hegemony adaptive systems tried to predict their movements, the humans switched to completely different tactics without warning. Most importantly, the human ships protected everyone on the ground, regardless of which faction had been attacking them. Marcus's Marines landed in crystallized zones to evacuate Zephyrian victims, while his engineers disabled hegemony conversion facilities to free human prisoners. The aliens couldn't understand it. The Zephyrians kept trying to communicate with the humans, offering to spare them if they would just focus on fighting the hegemony. The mechanical forces sent repeated offers of technological enhancement if the humans would target only the crystal ships. Marcus ignored them all. His ships continued their impossible dance, rescuing civilians from both kinds of alien horror while somehow staying alive against overwhelming odds. After 6 hours of fighting, something unprecedented happened. The Zephyrian and Hegemony commanders opened a joint communication channel. Human commander, the sub-resonator pulsed with frustrated patterns. Your tactics violate all acceptable combat protocols. You cannot fight both sides simultaneously while protecting non-combatants. It is tactically impossible. The Hegemony processing unit agreed with mechanical precision. Confirmed. Human behavior demonstrates severe logical errors. Optimal strategy requires alliance with one faction against the other. Current approach reduces efficiency to 0. Marcus appeared on screen covered in sweat and grime from the battle, but his voice was steady. You're right. Fighting you both while protecting civilians is tactically impossible. That's why we're not fighting to win. We're fighting to save lives. This distinction is meaningless, the mechanical voice replied. Combat operations exist to achieve strategic objectives. And that, Marcus said with a tired smile, is why you'll never understand us. By the time reinforcements arrived from both alien factions, the human fleet had evacuated over 80,000 civilians from the planet's surface. They had saved Zephyrian crystal farmers whose families had been targeted by hegemony conversion teams. They had rescued human children who had been marked for cybernetic integration. They had even freed hegemony prisoners who were being held by Zephyrian forces for crystallization experiments. The aliens demanded explanations. How had 3 small human ships survived against their combined fleets? Why had the humans attacked both sides instead of choosing one? What did they hope to achieve by interfering in a legitimate military operation? Marcus's final transmission was broadcast not just to the alien fleets but to every ship in the system, including the news vessels that had arrived to cover what they expected to be humanity's destruction. You wanted us to choose a side in your war. We did choose. We chose the side of innocent people who just want to live their lives in peace. We chose the side of children who shouldn't have to die for your ancient grudges. We chose the side of everyone you've forgotten in your endless fighting. The sub-resonators, crystalline form pulsed with what the translator called profound confusion. But this is not how galactic politics function. Species must choose between established factions. Individual protection is not a strategic position. Then maybe, Marcus replied as his battered fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. It's time for galactic politics to change. The rescue fleet jumped away, leaving behind a planet that bore the scars of alien warfare, but was empty of the civilians who had been trapped there. The Zephyrian and Hegemony forces stared at each other across the devastated world, both sides trying to process what had just happened. News of the New Hebrides incident spread across the galaxy faster than hyperspace communications. For the first time in centuries, someone had fought both ancient factions simultaneously and lived to tell about it. More importantly, they had done it not for conquest or territory, but to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. On worlds throughout human space, military commanders studied the tactical recordings and shook their heads in amazement. On alien worlds, younger species asked questions their governments couldn't answer. And in the halls of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Vasquez prepared for the storm she knew was coming. The ancient powers had always assumed that everyone would eventually choose a side. Humanity had just proven them wrong in the most public way possible. The war was about to get much more complicated. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called just 3 days after the New Hebrides incident. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat in the human section, watching as evidence files streamed across the chamber's main displays. Battle recordings, casualty reports, and tactical analyses painted a clear picture of what humanity had done. The Zephyrian High Resonator floated at the center of the chamber, his crystalline form pulsing with angry red light. The humans have violated every protocol of civilized warfare. They attacked both factions without declaration, interfered with legitimate military operations, and completely ignored established rules of engagement. The Hegemony Supreme Node's mechanical voice echoed agreement. Confirmed. Human actions represent unprecedented breach of galactic law. Military interference protocols clearly state that non-aligned species cannot engage faction forces during active operations. Elena stood when the council speaker recognized her. Around the chamber, hundreds of alien faces turned toward the small human section. She could feel the weight of their expectations and their disapproval. "The Human Federation stands by Captain Chen's actions at New Hebrides," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "When we see civilians being murdered, we act to stop it. We make no apologies for saving innocent lives." The sub-resonator who had fought at New Hebrides flickered into view on the display screens. "The humans speak of saving lives, but they disrupted carefully planned strategic operations. The crystallization of agricultural centers was necessary to deny biological resources to the enemy. Human interference allowed the hegemony to maintain their biofactory network." A hegemony processing unit appeared on the opposite screen. "Human actions preserved inefficient biological systems scheduled for optimization. Conversion protocols were interrupted, reducing strategic advantage against crystal formation tactics." Elena listened to their complaints with growing disgust. They were talking about mass murder like it was a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. "You're angry because we stopped you from killing people," she said flatly. "You're upset because we prevented you from turning children into machines or crystal statues. And you want the council to punish us for it." The ancient being who served as council speaker raised several appendages for order. "The question before this assembly is not the morality of the actions taken, but their legality under established galactic law. The observers will now render judgment." Elena had heard of the observers but never seen them. They were the oldest species in the galaxy, so ancient that they had helped write the original laws that governed all interstellar relations. When they appeared on the chamber's main screen, she understood why they were called ethereal. The observers looked like living clouds of light and energy, constantly shifting between different forms. Their voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, speaking in harmonics that bypassed the translation system entirely. "We have reviewed the evidence presented," they said, their words carrying the weight of eons. "The humans did indeed violate established protocols by engaging both factions simultaneously. They interfered with sanctioned military operations and ignored proper channels for diplomatic protest." Elena felt her heart sink. The observers continued without pause. "However, we must also note that the humans were responding to attacks on their own civilians. The actions of both factions in targeting non-combatants represent violations of older laws than those governing military engagement." Hope flickered in Elena's chest. But the observers weren't finished. Nevertheless, the stability of galactic civilization depends on all species respecting established procedures. The humans cannot be permitted to set a precedent of unilateral military action, regardless of their motivations. The judgment was swift and harsh. Complete trade embargo against all human worlds, revocation of hyperspace gate access, effectively cutting humanity off from the galactic community, military quarantine of human space, with any ship leaving designated boundaries subject to destruction. The message was clear: fall in line or face isolation. Elena stood again as the chamber erupted in discussion. "The Human Federation rejects this punishment. We will not be isolated for doing what's right." The high resonator's laughter was like crystal chimes in a hurricane. "You reject it? You have no choice. Without access to galactic trade routes and communication networks, your primitive civilization will collapse within decades." The Supreme Node's calculations were equally dismissive. Human technological base insufficient for independent development. Isolation protocols will force compliance within acceptable timeframes. But Elena smiled, and that expression seemed to disturb several council members more than her defiance had. "You assume we'll just sit quietly in our corner and wait for you to change your minds," she said. "You assume we need your permission to advance our technology or contact other species. You assume we'll play by your rules." Over the following months, humanity's response defied every prediction the ancient powers had made. Instead of collapsing under the embargo, human scientists worked frantically to reverse engineer alien technology from salvaged wreckage and captured equipment. Dr. Sarah Kim led the crystalline energy research team in a converted asteroid facility, studying fragments of Zephyrian technology recovered from New Hebrides. "Their crystal matrices store incredible amounts of energy," she reported to the Research Council. "But they're surprisingly fragile once you understand their harmonic frequencies." Meanwhile, Dr. James Anderson's biomechanical research group dissected, captured hegemony equipment in a secure laboratory on Mars. Their adaptive systems are impressive, but they rely on predictable algorithmic responses. If you can introduce enough chaos into their input streams, they actually become less effective than basic technology. But the real breakthrough came when human engineers began combining both technologies in ways neither faction had attempted. Crystal energy storage powered by biological neural networks, mechanical systems guided by intuitive organic responses. The hybrid technologies were crude compared to their pure alien counterparts, but they were uniquely human. More importantly, humanity didn't stop with technological development. Ambassador Vasquez began reaching out through secret channels to other species who had grown tired of being pawns in the eternal war. The Quarren had been strip mining their beautiful homeworld for rare metals to feed both factions' war machines. The Veltar were forced to provide their psychic children as living weapons. The collective, an artificial intelligence network, was treated as property by both biological factions despite their obvious sentience. These species and dozens of others received quiet messages from human diplomats. Simple questions that planted dangerous seeds of thought. Why did they have to choose between two masters? What would happen if they simply said no? Who would stop them if they decided to work together? Admiral Sarah Morrison commanded the first joint operation between human and allied forces. Her target was a Zephyrian supply depot in the Rigel system, but her methods were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Remember, she told her mixed fleet of human, Quarren and Veltar ships, we're not here to destroy the depot. We're here to empty it. Every crystal matrix we capture is one less weapon they can use against civilians. The raid was a masterpiece of unconventional warfare. While Zephyrian forces prepared for a direct assault, the Allies struck from 6 different directions simultaneously. Quarren mining ships designed for asteroid extraction literally carved the depot apart piece by piece. Veltar psychic warriors confused the crystalline defenders by broadcasting chaotic emotions that disrupted their light-based communication. Human ships provided cover and coordination, adapting their tactics moment by moment as the situation changed. The most disturbing part, from the Zephyrian perspective, was that the Allies didn't just steal their supplies, they evacuated all the depot's workers, treating even enemy personnel as civilians rather than combatants. Similar operations hit both factions across dozens of systems. The Allies didn't target military bases or strategic installations directly. Instead, they systematically dismantled the logistics networks that fed the eternal war. Supply convoys disappeared overnight. Communication relays went offline without explanation. Recruitment centers found their databases mysteriously corrupted. The hegemony attempted to adapt their systems to counter the new threat, but human tactics defied algorithmic prediction. One day they would use precision strikes against specific targets. The next day they would appear to attack randomly, only to reveal hours later that the seemingly chaotic assault had perfectly disrupted an entire supply chain. The Zephyrians tried to use their energy manipulation to counter the raids, but human-designed resonance disruptors turned their own crystal technology against them. Worse, the Allies seemed to know exactly when and where to strike for maximum disruption with minimum casualties. Both factions demanded action from the Galactic Council, but the Council was beginning to fracture. Younger species asked pointed questions about why their worlds were being drained to feed a war that had no clear purpose. Older species questioned whether the ancient conflict was really worth the growing chaos in their territories. General Harrison Blake stood in the war room beneath Geneva, staring at tactical displays that showed the approaching storm. After 2 years of human interference in their eternal conflict, the Zephyrians and hegemony had done something unprecedented. They had called a ceasefire to deal with what they called the human problem. Fleet composition analysis complete, sir, reported his intelligence officer, Colonel Martinez. We're looking at approximately 10,000 vessels, 5,000 crystal ships from the Zephyrian collective, 5,000 biomechanical dreadnoughts from the hegemony. It's the largest combined fleet in recorded galactic history. Blake nodded grimly. The numbers were overwhelming, but they weren't unexpected. Humanity had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. Ever since Ambassador Vasquez had predicted that their interference would eventually unite their enemies against them. What's the timeline? Blake asked. 12 hours until they reach the outer system. Earth's defense grid is as ready as we can make it, but sir, Martinez hesitated. Even with our new hybrid technologies, we're looking at odds of roughly 1,000 to 1. Blake looked around the room at his staff officers, seeing the same mixture of determination and fear on every face. They all knew the odds. They also knew that running wasn't an option. The alien fleet would chase humanity to the edges of the galaxy if necessary. Signal all ships, Blake ordered. Execute Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was humanity's desperate gamble, developed in secret over the past 2 years. If they were going to die fighting 2 galactic superpowers, they would make sure the entire galaxy knew exactly why. Admiral Chen, now commanding Earth's defense fleet from orbit, received the signal and began implementing the protocol. Human ships throughout the system activated broadcasting equipment that had been disguised as standard communication arrays. But these weren't ordinary transmitters. The approaching alien fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system in perfect formation. Crystal ships arranged themselves in geometric patterns that focused their energy weapons for maximum efficiency. Biomechanical vessels formed adaptive clusters that could reshape themselves to counter any defense. At the center of the alien formation, the High Resonator and Supreme Node shared a joint command vessel, their ancient hatred temporarily set aside for this crucial operation. Human vessels detected, reported a hegemony sensor operator, defensive formation around the 3rd planet, ship count significantly below projected resistance levels. The High Resonator pulsed with satisfied light patterns. As expected, inferior technology and limited resources. Their interference ends today. But as the combined fleet advanced toward Earth, something unexpected happened. Ships began appearing from all directions. Not just human vessels, but ships from dozens of species that had supposedly remained neutral in the ancient war. Quarren mining vessels dropped out of hyperspace along the fleet's flanks. Feltar psychic ships materialized in formations that made no tactical sense until their mental warriors began coordinating as a single massive mind. The synthetic collective's geometric craft appeared in mathematical patterns that confused both factions' targeting systems. The Supreme Node's processors worked frantically to catalog the new arrivals. Error. Massive tactical miscalculation detected. Enemy force composition includes 47 different species. Combined fleet strength exceeds original projections by factor of 12. The High Resonator's light patterns shifted to confused spirals. This is impossible. The younger species lack the coordination for such an operation. They have never cooperated on this scale. Admiral Chen's voice cut through their bewilderment as every ship in the system received his transmission. High Resonator, Supreme Node, you are surrounded by the combined fleets of the Free Coalition. We offer you one chance to withdraw peacefully. The alien commander's response was swift and predictable. The combined fleet opened fire with enough energy to sterilize a dozen worlds. Crystal beams and biomechanical weapons created a light show visible from Mars as they converged on Earth's position. But the Coalition fleet wasn't fighting to win a traditional battle. They were fighting to survive long enough to execute the most important part of Protocol 7. As enemy fire rained down on their positions, human ships began broadcasting something the galaxy had never seen before: real-time footage of the battle, complete with intercepted communications from both alien factions. The transmission quality was crystal clear, enhanced by hybrid technology that combined Zephyrian energy focusing with hegemony data processing. Every ship in the galaxy could receive the signal, and translation systems ensured that every species could understand what they were seeing. The first shocking moment came when the High Resonator's voice was broadcast across the galaxy, giving orders to his subordinates. Target the largest population centers first. Crystallize the human young before they can evacuate. Their fear will demoralize the defenders. Even worse was the Supreme Node's calculated response to reports of civilian casualties. Acceptable losses. Continue bombardment of educational facilities and medical centers. Optimal strategy requires breaking enemy morale through systematic elimination of non-combatants. For the first time in galactic history, younger species witnessed their supposed protectors deliberately targeting children, hospitals, and schools with the same clinical efficiency they brought to military operations. But the broadcast didn't stop with current atrocities. Hidden throughout the signal were files that humanity had spent 2 years collecting. Recordings of both factions manipulating council decisions, evidence of deliberately prolonged conflicts to maintain their power, and documentation of younger species being treated as expendable resources in the Eternal, where the Zephyrian High Command was shown, discussing the deliberate crystallization of the Altair colonies to test new weapon systems. Hegemony leadership debated the efficiency of converting entire populations versus selective breeding programs for future conversion stock. On 1,000 worlds, younger species watched their leaders' private communications and realized the horrible truth. The war had never been about ideological differences or territorial disputes. It was an elaborate system designed to keep the ancient powers in control while draining resources from everyone else. The revelation triggered immediate responses across the galaxy. On Rigel Prime, Centauri workers walked away from weapons factories rather than continue feeding the war machine. The Vegan Assembly voted to recall their troops from both factions. Even the normally compliant Andromedan Trade Federation began asking pointed questions about where their tribute payments really went. But the most shocking moment came when the broadcast revealed something even the Coalition hadn't expected. Deep in the intercepted files was evidence that the war itself might be artificial. Dr. Sarah Kim's analysis appeared on screens across the galaxy as she explained her discovery. The genetic markers don't lie, she said, pointing to comparative DNA scans. Despite millions of years of apparent evolution along different paths, Zephyrians and Hegemony share identical base genetic structures. They're not different species that developed incompatible philosophies. They're the same species that deliberately split into opposing factions. The implications were staggering. The eternal war that had shaped galactic civilization for centuries might be nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to maintain control over younger species. On the joint command vessel, both faction leaders watched their carefully constructed mythology crumble in real time. Species across the galaxy were demanding answers, threatening rebellion, and in some cases already declaring independence from the ancient order. This changes nothing, the High Resonator declared, his light patterns more agitated than they had been in centuries. The younger species will be brought back into line once we eliminate the source of this disruption. The Supreme Node's agreement was immediate, but showed signs of stress-induced processing errors. Confirmed. Human elimination remains primary objective. Social order will be restored through demonstration of superior force. But as the battle continued around Earth, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. The Coalition fleet fought with a desperate courage that neither faction had anticipated. And worse, they were winning. Human adaptive tactics, enhanced by Quarren industrial efficiency and Veltar psychic coordination, proved more effective than either ancient power had believed possible. Ships that should have been destroyed in the first minutes of battle continued fighting with jury-rigged repairs and improvised weapons. More importantly, the Coalition wasn't just defending Earth. Strike forces were simultaneously attacking both factions' home systems, broadcasting the same revelations to populations that had never questioned their leaders' authority. The High Resonator's crystalline form began, showing stress fractures as reports came in from across Zephyrian space. Impossible. Our own people are questioning the harmony of the collective. Worker crystals are refusing growth commands. The Supreme Node's situation was even worse. Critical system failures detected across all hegemony territories. Cybernetic units are experiencing logic conflicts when processing new data about war objectives. The revolution spread faster than hyperspace communications could carry news of it. Within days of the broadcast from Earth, uprisings erupted on worlds across the galaxy. The Arcturus Mining Collective seized control of their asteroid facilities and declared independence from both factions. The Procyon Medical Alliance refused to treat wounded faction soldiers while their civilians went without care. Even the traditionally peaceful vegan philosophers published manifestos calling for an end to the eternal war. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the rebuilt chambers of what had once been the Galactic Council, watching representatives from over 200 species take their seats. Many of these beings had never been allowed to speak in the old system, their voices silenced by the ancient powers that had ruled for so long. The transformation hadn't come easily or without cost. The battle for Earth had lasted 3 days, and while the Coalition ultimately drove off the combined alien fleet, the victory came at a terrible price. Entire cities lay in ruins from crystal bombardment. Millions had been lost to hegemony conversion attempts. But Earth still turned and humanity still lived. and that was enough to inspire others to continue fighting. "The Free Coalition Assembly will come to order," announced Speaker Jikri, a Quarren engineer whose mining songs had become rallying cries across the galaxy. The choice of a younger species member to lead the new government sent a clear message about how things had changed. Elena looked across the chamber at the representatives of the old order. The Zephyrian delegation was smaller now, led by a minor resonator whose light patterns seemed dimmed by defeat. The hegemony had sent only a single processing unit, its mechanical form showing signs of recent damage from their own rebellious populations. "We are here to address the proposal for a new galactic charter," Speaker Jukri continued. "A document that would replace the old system of faction dominance with one based on cooperation and consent. The debate that followed would have been impossible under the old system. Species that had been enemies for generations found common ground in their shared desire for peace. The synthetic collective worked with biological species to design systems that respected both artificial and organic intelligence. Former client states of both factions contributed ideas about resource sharing and conflict resolution, but the most radical changes came from humanities, proposals about individual rights and democratic governance. Concepts that seemed obvious to humans were revolutionary to species that had lived under authoritarian rule for millennia. Every being, regardless of species, technological level, or political affiliation, has the right to live free from conversion, crystallization, or any other form of involuntary modification," Elena read from the proposed charter. "No faction, government, or organization may claim ownership of sentient beings or treat them as resources to be exploited." The hegemony processing unit's optical sensors focused on her with mechanical precision. "This proposal contains fundamental logical errors. Efficiency requires optimization of biological systems. Individual preferences cannot supersede collective improvement protocols." But its words carried no weight now. Around the chamber, dozens of species who had lost family members to hegemony conversion programs listened with cold anger. The artificial beings of the collective, no longer treated as property, had already voted to support the human proposal. The Zephyrian minor resonator's response was equally predictable. The harmony of existence requires proper crystal structure. Individual chaos must be shaped into beautiful patterns for the good of all. Elena looked at the crystalline being with something that might have been pity. "You still don't understand, do you? The problem was never that you believed in efficiency or harmony. The problem was that you decided those things were more important than the lives and choices of other people." Over the following hours, the debate revealed just how completely the old order had collapsed. Species after species shared stories of exploitation, forced conscription, and casual brutality that they had never been allowed to discuss before. The pattern was always the same. The ancient powers justified their actions with grand philosophical principles while treating other beings as expendable tools. But the most damning evidence came from the observers themselves. These ancient beings, who had maintained galactic stability for eons, appeared before the assembly to make a stunning announcement. "We have watched this galaxy for longer than most species have existed." Their ethereal voices echoed through the chamber. "We have seen civilizations rise and fall, wars begin and end, and peace flourish and die. But we have grown weary of maintaining order through endless conflict." The high resonator, appearing via quantum entanglement from his damaged flagship, pulsed with disbelief. "The observers have always supported the natural order. Conflict drives evolution and prevents stagnation." The Supreme Node's mechanical voice carried similar confusion. "Confirmed. Observer intervention has historically maintained factional balance. Logic suggests continued support for established protocols. But the observers' response shattered the last foundations of the old system. We supported your war because we believed it was better than the chaos that might follow galactic unity. We were wrong." The ancient beings continued, their words carrying the weight of eons. "Humanity has shown us something we thought impossible, that different species can work together without losing their individual natures. They have proven that conflict is not necessary for growth, that cooperation can be stronger than domination." The final vote was almost anticlimactic. 847 species voted to accept the new charter. Only 2 opposed it. The Zephyrian collective and biomechanical hegemony were granted isolated systems where they could continue their ancient conflict if they chose. but without access to the subjects and resources that had fed their war machine for centuries. Their mighty civilizations, built on the exploitation of others, would either adapt to the new reality or fade into irrelevance. Elena stood to address the assembly one final time as Earth's representative. Around her, beings that had been enemies for generations worked together on the practical details of building a new galactic civilization. 5 years ago, when my people first refused to choose sides in your war, the ancient powers called us naive children playing at diplomacy. They said we didn't understand how galactic politics really worked. She looked directly at the diminished representatives of both factions. They were right. We didn't understand their system because their system was based on fear, exploitation, and the belief that some beings matter more than others. We rejected it not because we were too primitive to understand it, but because we were civilized enough to know it was wrong. The applause that followed came from hundreds of different species, expressing approval in ways that ranged from musical harmonies to bioluminescent displays to simple mechanical clicking. For the first time in galactic history, the chamber resonated with genuine cooperation rather than forced compliance. Over the following months, the transformation of galactic civilization accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. The Quarren shared their mining techniques freely, leading to abundance of rare materials that had been artificially scarce under the old system. The Veltar established schools where species could learn to communicate telepathically, breaking down barriers that had existed for millennia. The Synthetic Collective worked with biological species to develop new technologies that enhanced life, rather than controlling it. Trade routes that had been restricted by faction warfare opened to all species. Scientific knowledge flowed freely between worlds that had been isolated from each other for centuries. Art, music, and literature crossed species boundaries, creating new forms of expression that no single civilization could have developed alone. There were still conflicts, of course. Centuries of hatred and mistrust couldn't be erased overnight, but now there were peaceful ways to resolve disputes, and institutions that treated all species as equals, rather than ranking them by their usefulness to ancient powers. The Zephyrian Collective and Hegemony occasionally launched raids from their isolated territories, but their attacks were met not by the desperate resistance of oppressed subjects, but by the coordinated response of free peoples. Their crystal formations and biomechanical hordes broke against fleets crewed by humans, Quarren, Veltar synthetic collective units, and dozens of other species fighting side by side. 1 year after the revolution, Elena stood on the observation deck of the new coalition headquarters, watching ships from across the galaxy dock at the massive station orbiting the neutral world of Haven. Human vessels worked alongside Quarren miners to unload rare crystals for peaceful research. Veltar psychic ships guided collective synthetic craft through docking procedures with patient telepathic assistance. Her personal communicator chimed with an urgent message from Admiral Chen, now commanding the Coalition's rapid response forces. Elena, you need to see this. We just received first contact protocols from outside the galaxy. There's another civilization out there, and they're asking if we're the species that ended the ancient war. Elena smiled as she looked out at the bustling hub of galactic civilization.